Hello, and welcome to World of Warbirds. I'm Brian Pierce. Hello, Warbirders. So this topic is number 3 in a very infrequent series I call the Citizen Soldier series. Just like the human citizen soldier, in my mind, the Citizen Soldier Warbird would be an aircraft that existed first as a civilian model, but then got drafted into service as a warrior. This is the first Allied citizen soldier story that I've done. The first two served in the Luftwaffe and are the FW-200 Condor and the Ju-52. Based on my listener stats and the popularity of some of my social media posts, the Ju-52 still shows to have an incredibly affectionate fan base in Germany. I wonder if this warbird will have the same sort of affection in Allied countries. I think it might. But I think those 2 episodes are also worth a listen if you haven't yet. Before we get into the show, I have to welcome some new Patreon supporters to my crew. Jim Reek, Greg Gray, Almos Alfasi, and Matt Lynn. I hope I pronounced all those properly. Thank you for caring enough to help keep the show going. All right, let's dive in. So before we get to the Gooney bird itself, we're going to start looking today at Donald Wills Douglas Sr. We've looked at a couple of his products already, but we haven't been properly introduced to the man. He was born on April 6th, 1892. Like so many of our aviation icons, he was bitten early by that aviation bug. In 1908, at the age of 16, he hounded his mother to go see the Wright Flyer in action. The next year, after graduation, he enrolled in the Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. He remained there for 3 years, and while he was training to be a naval officer, he also indulged his aviation obsession by building model airplanes in his dorm room and testing them on the Academy's grounds. In 1912, the obsession to build rather than serve won out, and he resigned from the Academy in order to pursue a career in aeronautical engineering. He enrolled at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, and graduated in 1914 as one of the youngest students in his class, quickly demonstrating his superior aptitude for aeronautical engineering. Yes, I checked those dates, and yes, I confirm that he got that degree in half the time it usually takes. He worked for a variety of companies for the next 5 years, including the Connecticut Aircraft Company, the Glenn Martin Company, where at the still kind of tender age of 23, he was chief engineer, and then in November 1916, became the Chief Civilian Aeronautical Engineer of the Aviation Section of the U.S. Army Signal Corps. After that, he bounced back to Glenn L. Martin Company in Cleveland, Ohio, again becoming their chief engineer. In 1920, he founded his own company, the Douglas Aircraft Company in Santa Monica, California. Not only was he a talented aeronautical engineer, but he was also a business genius. Douglas Aircraft went from a tiny concern with only 68 employees in 1922 to eventually being the 4th largest business in the entire United States. The actual story of the Gooney bird starts with the DC-1, which is aptly named in a couple of ways. The first is that DC stands for Douglas Commercial. Did you know that? I didn't. There's a texting acronym, TDIL, which means Today I Learned, and I literally did today. The 1 makes sense as it was the first one of its type, and I guess it also makes sense because they only built one of them. The origins of the DC-1 start back in 1931 due to the crash of a TWA airliner, a Fokker F-10. The impact of this crash, sorry for the pun, cannot be overstated. You may not be familiar with the Fokker F-10, but you could probably conjure up the image of a Ford trimotor, and it looked a lot like that. En route from Kansas City to Los Angeles, the airplane suddenly crashed into an open field and all 8 people on board were killed. Now, things may have turned out differently if different people had been on board, but one of the victims of the crash was Knute Rockne, the head football coach of the University of Notre Dame. He wasn't just any coach. During his tenure, Rockne transformed Notre Dame football into a national powerhouse. He led the team to an astonishing record of 105 wins, 12 losses, and 5 ties, including 3 national championships in 1924, 1929, and 1930. Not only was Rockne a legend in the world of sport, but he was also a cultural icon before he had even turned 40. His speeches and leadership inspired countless players and fans, and he became a symbol of the American dream, immigrant success, grit, determination, and pure excellence. Ever heard the phrase, "win one for the Gipper"? Yes, it was made by Rockne to his players during a rallying halftime speech. That line of dialogue was spoken by an actor you may have heard of named Ronald Reagan, who played Rockne in the 1940 motion picture Knute Rockne, All-American. Reagan, who obviously went on to do other things, such as becoming President of the United States, later used the phrase in political speeches, and it became one of the most enduring quotes in sports and political history. So when Rockne, this sport and cultural icon, was cut down in his prime in a plane crash, people noticed. There was an investigation, and it was determined that the wing had probably failed due to water seepage between the laminated layers of the wood in the wing. This water infiltration had dissolved the glue holding the layers together, and the wing had disintegrated. So the aeronautics branch of the U.S. Department of Commerce, which was a precursor to the FAA, imposed restrictions on the use of wooden wings on passenger airliners. Thus, there was a push for all-metal airliners. Now, Boeing developed their 247, which was a twin-engined, all-metal monoplane with a retractable undercarriage. Boeing had set the bar high with the 247. I mentioned it in part 1 of my B-17 series, where I described her as the mom of the B-17. There is a 247 at the museum in Ottawa that I visit often. The 247 airliner had been built with reliable and comfortable airline travel in mind. It had good cabin heating, air conditioning, and soundproofing. But TWA couldn't get their hands on them. 247s were reserved for the use of United Airlines, which was part of the United Aircraft and Transport Corporation, which also owned Boeing. So TWA needed something else to compete with the 247, and so put out a request to 5 other manufacturers for bids for the construction of an all-metal, 3-engined, 12-seat aircraft capable of flying 1,080 miles, that's 1,740 kilometers, at 150 miles per hour, which is 242 kilometers per hour. This new plane would have to be capable of taking off safely from any airport on TWA's main line at any possible ambient temperature, with 1 engine of the 3 non-functional. Knowing what we know now about the eventual airplane, it almost seems comical that Donald Douglas was initially wary of participating in the TWA offer. He figured that there might not be enough demand for even 100 aircraft, the number of sales that was deemed necessary to cover the initial development costs. But go ahead they did, and they built a single DC-1. But what an aircraft it was. I find it interesting that it just looks right. In a time where many aircraft were not very aerodynamically clean, or were biplanes, or had corrugated skins, or wires, or extra engines on the nose, and fixed gear, or ram air turbines sticking out all over the place. The DC-1 just didn't. This may sound a little overblown, but the DC-1 didn't seem to me like it was constructed by mere mortals at all. But it was like it was hatched out of some divine egg and grew into the perfect shape that an airliner should be. That would be the model for all others that would follow it for the next century. Alright, let's dial it back a little bit, Brian, but the DC-1 really was remarkable. As I said before, they only built one of them, and it first flew on July 1st, 1933. It was given the model name DC-1, or Douglas Commercial Model 1. It was subjected to over 200 test flights, where it demonstrated a marked improvement over the airliners of the time, which were the Ford Trimotor and Fokker Trimotor, and it did so with only 2 engines. The DC-1 was an all-metal, low-wing aircraft powered by 2 Wright Cyclone 9-cylinder air-cooled radial piston engines generating 690 horsepower each. These turned variable pitch propellers, which were novel at the time. It could carry 12 passengers in relative comfort for the day. It was insulated against noise, was heated and crewed by 2 pilots and a flight attendant. And yes, it was fully capable of performing a controlled takeoff or landing on one of its 2 engines, even in Albuquerque, New Mexico, in scorching summer temperatures. It was 60 feet in length, with a wingspan of 85 feet and a height of 16 feet. Its maximum speed was 210 miles per hour, that's 340 kilometers per hour, but would cruise at 190 miles an hour, which is 310 kilometers per hour, or 170 knots for those who prefer that unit. Its range was about 1,000 miles, with a service ceiling of 23,000 feet, that's 7,000 meters. On February 19th, 1934, the DC-1 was flown across the United States in a record-breaking time of 13 hours, 5 minutes. TWA liked what it saw, except they asked for more powerful engines and added 2 more passenger seats. They ordered an initial 20 units, and this updated version would be called the DC-2. The one and only DC-1 was operated by TWA until 1938, when it was sold to a British Member of Parliament in the UK, and then went to a French buyer, and then finally to Spain, where it flew for a time with Iberia Airlines until a forced landing on October 4th, 1940, when it was deemed too damaged to repair. It's a shame that the first in this line of this icon was not saved as a museum piece. But, for the purposes of our story, it is now time to pass the torch to the DC-2. So, with the requests put forward by TWA, Douglas lengthened the updated airliner by about a foot, and added in an extra row of 2 passenger seats and widened the fuselage slightly. To compensate, new versions of the Wright Cyclone 9-cylinder engine pushed out 775 horsepower each. In May of 1934, the DC-2 took to the air and turned heads. As agreed, TWA got the first 20 units, but other airlines and even other countries were interested, and either placed orders for aircraft or purchased licenses to build their own. Even Fokker, whose trimotor crash had kicked off this Gooney bird story, purchased a production license. Almost 200 DC-2s were built and served with what seems like the majority of the world's airliners and air forces of the time. The aircraft became a media star too. If you've ever heard the old-timey song, Good Ship Lollipop, that Shirley Temple sang, well, it wasn't about a boat, it was about a DC-2. In Ernest Gahn's flying memoir, entitled Fate is the Hunter, He describes his early days flying as a commercial pilot, piloting DC-2s. Have you ever read Fate is the Hunter? If you call yourself a historical aviation enthusiast and you haven't, well, you are missing out. When I first told my dad that I had been bitten by the aviation bug, he tossed me his copy of the book, and I initially ignored it. There was no bomb dropping, gun shooting, or rocket firing involved. How could it possibly be interesting? Man, was I wrong. Gann's powerful and gritty writing puts you right in these loud and smelly cockpits, flying in all kinds of crazy situations, from extreme heat to extreme cold to over the mountains to not being able to climb to near misses, which are near hits, by the way. I recall he and his fellow pilot fighting for survival in heavy icing conditions in a DC-2. But if the DC-2 was deemed successful, what would follow would need a new word to describe its excellence and longevity. And it started with a need that barely exists anymore in modern commercial aviation, except for the more luxurious of passenger classes. The sleeper. American Airlines CEO C.R. Smith wanted to upgrade his company's Curtiss Condor II biplanes with modern sleeper aircraft. He liked the DC-2, but it was 30 inches too narrow to accommodate side-by-side sleeping berths. That kind of fuselage change would be a major and costly undertaking. And supposedly it was in a marathon phone call that Donald Douglas arm-twisted Smith to commit to buying at least 20 of the widened aircraft to cover the upgrade costs. The new airliner was initially called the DST, the Douglas Sleeper Transport. It first flew on December 17, 1935, which just happened to be the 32nd anniversary of the Wright brothers' flight at Kitty Hawk. And the company was so confident in their product that this aircraft cannot be truly called a prototype. It was also the first production model and was delivered to American Airlines. Its widened cabin was 92 inches in girth and was set up for 14 to 16 sleeping berths. The version of the aircraft that was installed with 21 seats instead of the sleeping bunks was known as the DC-3. DC-3 passenger flights kicked off on June 26, 1936, with service from Newark, New Jersey, and Chicago, Illinois. The DC-3 and DST made practical air travel possible in the United States. Eastbound flights could cross the U.S. in about 15 hours with 3 stops for fuel, while westbound trips against the prevailing winds took about 3 hours more. After the initial American contract was fulfilled, United, TWA, Eastern, and Delta Airlines placed orders for over 400 DC-3s. After that, KLM, Royal Dutch Airlines, received its first DC-3s also. Just over 600 DC-3s were built for the commercial market, and right around the midway point of their production, the DC-3 heard the bugle call. The Gooney bird was going to war. But first, what about that nickname Gooney bird? Where did it come from? It was actually the DC-2, or more specifically, a military version of the DC-2 known as the R2D, and I'm really controlling myself here to not say R2D2, but it was an R2D that was first dubbed with the endearing moniker when operating out of Midway Island out in the Pacific. A bird known as the long-winged albatross is native to Midway, and although extremely graceful in the air, it's kinda ungainly and goofy on the ground. The bird itself got the nickname Gooney bird, but then someone drew a link between the big goofy bird walking around and the big goofy plane lumbering around while taxiing on the ground. Once the link was made, the nickname stuck, and it would be one of many. With the outbreak of World War II, U.S. Code 2644, the control of transportation systems in time of war was brought into force. This act of Congress states, opening quotes, "In time of war, the President, through the Secretary of Defense, may take possession and assume control of all or part of any system of transportation to transport troops, war materiel, and equipment, or for other purposes related to the emergency. So far as necessary, he may use the system to the exclusion of other traffic." Close quotes. So in other words, the DC-3 was drafted. Another term that was used was impressment, which for me conjures up the image of Royal Navy press gangs roaming through the streets of merry old England during the Age of Sail, scooping up and dragging out sloshed pub patrons to serve on some ship of the line. Here, civilian airliners were being scooped up by the government from the flight line and sent to the front line. Now, you've heard me say stuff like this before, but there is a truly dizzying series of designations for DC-3s and their variants. Whether they were impressed civil aircraft or purpose-built military versions. Wikipedia actually has a completely separate page to deal with the, open quotes, list of Douglas DC-3 family variants, close quotes. Just to give a little bit of color to this, there are 2 types of C-41, 4 types of C-47, 2 types of C-48, 11 types of C-49, 5 types of C-50, 1 lonely C-51, 4 C-52s, 5 C-53s, 1 C-68, and a Gooney bird in a pear tree. And all of those are basically DC-3s. So I will obviously be simplifying these down to a much more manageable list. So although hundreds of civilian DC-3s were drafted for national service, it was clear that there would not be enough of this highly useful transport. And so orders were placed for a purpose-built military transport which was known as the C-47. For its expected rough duty, the C-47 had a strengthened floor and other modifications to help do the jobs that the civil DC-3 could never imagine, including installing a big cargo door, an added hoist lifting device, and a shortened tail cone for the glider towing shackles. An astrodome was added to the cabin roof for celestial navigation sightings. There were other little differences too. The C-47 had 6 inches added to the wing center section, and it was 9 inches shorter than its civilian sisters. Fuel capacity was reduced down to 805 from 882 gallons. If longer range was needed for ferry flights, the cargo area could hold 8 to 9 100-gallon tanks in wooden cradles. The C-47 was named Skytrain for the Army, which was just one of the many, many names the aircraft would go by during its long history. It was powered by 2 1,200 horsepower Pratt & Whitney radial engines, and the normal payload was 5,000 pounds, which was 2,300 kilograms. But in a pinch, it could carry 7,000 pounds, that's 3,200 kilograms. The big rear fuselage cargo doors could accommodate jeeps, light trucks, or anything else that would possibly fit. Production output was staggering, with 10,000 of the type being built by Douglas. One factory alone, the Oklahoma City plant, produced 5,354 C-47s all by itself. The C-53 Skytrooper was considered strictly a troop transport and did not have the big cargo door, the hoist, or the reinforced floor of the C-47. it was found that the C-47 was more versatile, and so only 380 of the Sky Troopers were built. Of course, the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Marine Corps needed their own designation for the aircraft, and those were known as RD-48s, which again sounds like a droid from Star Wars. The type became one of the most adaptable and useful aircraft of all time. When looking over the list of what the Gooney bird did and would continue to do, it might be an easy cop-out to just say it did everything. But that would not do justice to its actual versatility. So here goes with a list of its uses that is not even comprehensive. Of course, at its most basic, the C-47 was a troop transport, with seats for 27 troops alongside the sides of the fuselage interior. It could carry soldiers into combat seated in seats, landing and climbing out, or jumping out the doors as paratroopers or in gliders behind being towed. It could tow 2 CG-4 Waco assault gliders or one of the larger British Horsa gliders. Either way, especially with the D-Day depictions of troopers loading up into invasion-striped Gooney birds, the C-47 has come to stand as the image of soldiers and paratroopers flying into battle. Almost 1,000 aerial ambulances were fitted to evacuate casualties. They could carry 18 stretcher cases and a medical crew of 3 to care for them. So, interestingly enough, not only was the C-47 the steed that carried you into battle, but was also the savior that flew you out to safety and to the more advanced medical care to the rear. And maybe even home for some. In this way, the Gooney birds were cemented in the Allied eyes with an affectionate aura. There was even a system for C-47s to snatch and pick up the combat gliders after the battle was over. I have an episode on this, but in a nutshell, the C-47s that were equipped for this duty would approach the glider requiring pickup at about 20 feet above the terrain, and at about 130 to 145 miles per hour. At the moment the tow rope, which had been previously suspended from poles, was snagged by the C-47's trailing hook, the winch drum would pay out cable rapidly, and then more slowly as the internal brake took effect. Within 7 seconds, the glider would accelerate from 0 to 120 miles per hour, and would become airborne in as little as 60 feet, depending on the glider load. At the same time, the extra weight of the glider slowed the tow plane to about 105 miles per hour. Slowly, the cable drum braked to a full stop, and then reversed. The glider, now 500 or so feet behind the tow plane, was slowly winched into its proper trail distance. There was a search and rescue version, and one for photographic reconnaissance, and ELINT, that's electronic intelligence missions. There were VIP transports for the high mucky mucks. The XC-47C was tested with Edo Model 78 floats to turn it into a seaplane. It wasn't accepted at the time, but hold on to that thought for later. Some were modified specifically for high-altitude use or for operations in the far north or far south. The XGC-17 was a C-47 with engines removed and nacelles faired over and tested as a 40-seat troop glider. Yes, that is true, and I am not making it up. Many Gooney birds were transferred to the British, who called them Dakotas. Supposedly, this name comes from an abbreviation of Douglas Aircraft Company Transport Aircraft. This was abbreviated to DACOTA, Dakota. Change the C to a K, and you get the spelling of the American states. So perfect. There was a plan for the British to build their own Dakotas under license by the Airspeed Company, but I guess they were getting sufficient numbers that this wasn't required. On the other hand, the Soviets did build their own, and these were known as Lisunov Li-2, or the PS-84. This had begun back in 1935 when the Soviet Union had started buying DC-2s and DC-3s for Aeroflot. A production license was bought by the USSR on the 15th of July 1936. The Soviet-built aircraft were very similar to their American cousins, except they were powered by Shvetsov ASH-62IR radial engines, which were the Soviet versions of the 9-cylinder Wright R-1820 Cyclone 9s. The skid of the Li-2, which was also slightly thicker because of the metric gauges, were not the exact equivalents of the American alloy sheet metal. Some were modified to allow for ski landing gear in order to operate on snow. With the invasion of the USSR on the 22nd of June 1941, the production of the Li-2 was still seen as important enough to relocate the entire factory to the east out of harm's way, and by July 1942, the plant was producing again. A little while ago, I said that the Gooney bird was used for just about everything. Some of you may be jumping up and down and saying, hey, they weren't used as bombers. They weren't used as ground attack aircraft. They weren't used as fighters. Well, the Soviets did use theirs as bombers. Some Li-2s had a bomb sight and bomb racks and a defensive dorsal turret installed. 2 SHKAS machine guns on pivot mounts could be added on both sides of the rear fuselage near the cargo doors, making me think of Huey door gunners. Some even had machine guns installed in the nose. 4 250 kilo, that's 551 pound bombs could be carried on racks under the central fuselage, and similar bombs could be carried inside the large cargo area and tossed out the doors by the crew. So there, Gooney birds were used as bombers and ground attack, and we haven't even mentioned spooky gunships yet. I'll give it to you that I don't think they were ever used as fighters. Yet. The Soviets built almost 5,000 of their versions, and these were later known by the NATO reporting name CAB. But perhaps the most shocking variant of them all was the Showa and Nakajima L2D, built by the Japanese. Nakajima had been constructing license-built DC-2s since 1935, and in February 1938 they purchased the rights to build the DC-3. And they just kept on building them after Pearl Harbor. I'm not sure, but I can't think of any other aircraft type that was in production on both sides of the conflict. Yes, everybody used captured machines at one time or another, but I can't recall any other aircraft being produced and used by both Axis and Allies. Perhaps if the Luftwaffe hadn't had its venerable Ju-52, well, then the Germans might have used a variant of it also. The Japanese wartime version was powered by Kinsei 51-53 engines that turned out 1,325 horsepower and needed enlarged nacelles and larger propeller spinners. The cockpit bulkhead was also moved back 40 inches, that's 100 centimeters, so that all the crew members were in the forward compartment. Like the Soviet version, some of them had a dorsal turret, which looks a lot like the one on the Betty bomber, and some of them had installed door guns. One major difference with the Japanese version was that as time went on and shortages increased in Japan, more and more less critical metal parts were being replaced by wooden ones. In the end, rudders, stabilizers, ailerons, fins, elevators and entrance doors were all made of wood. And there were plans in the works for an all-wood variant near the end of the war. The Allies named the aircraft the Tabby. And in an interesting turn of events, following the surrender, the RAF used some captured L-2D Tabby aircraft in their RAF 118 wing, which operated C-47 Dakota aircraft. The Japanese Tabbies kept their white surrender livery with large blue and white SEAC, that's Southeast Asia Command, rondelles painted over the green surrender crosses. All right, I knew that this one was going to be a long one, given the incredible history and continuing service of the Gooney bird. So, we will continue with the wartime operational uses of the Goonies next week. If you get satisfaction from this show, whether you're listening to it while driving, flying, gardening, or even sitting in a dentist chair, why not give me a good review or drop a comment? I read them all. Also, please consider supporting me at World of Warbird's Patreon. It's only $5 a month. There are advantages at being a supporting patron of the podcast, such as getting the episodes a week earlier, getting bonus episodes, and having a say on future content. But mainly you'll have the satisfaction of being a member of my crew. If you are presently listening to this through Patreon, well, thank you for your support. Until next time.